Welcome. I'll repeat that. It's 1:01 and calling the meeting to order, and we have just verified there is a quorum. And I do have one matter subsequent to posting the agenda, and it's just a notice to the rest of my fellow board members that we've been chatting how General Manager Morris's contract only runs for a few more months, and that means I'm going to ask for a review of a potential extension of that contract in the next meeting. So that's just a notice that I'll be asking for that. And if you have any input between now and then, do let me know about that. And are there any other matters subsequent to posting the agenda? Not seeing directors. Okay. So let's turn to public comment on matters not listed on the agenda. I see 3 attendees, and at least on my screen at the bottom, you can use a raised hand feature if you have a comment not on the agenda. Not seeing any hands. So let's bring it to the consent calendar. So we have the minutes of August 21 and receipt of our financial statements. Anyone wishing to pull an item or have any questions? Any amendments? Not seeing any. Let's check for public comment on the consent calendar. Do we have any hands on consent? Not seeing that either. So do we have a motion?
So moved.
That was 3CE. Is there a second?
I have a question. If I
Right.
may, just to confirm the motion, that's just for adoption of the minutes, correct?
The consent has the minutes and the financials.
And
But we don't have to adopt financials, we just
we just
It's
received
just
them.
receiving
receive
them.
them.
Yes.
So I'll second the motion to adopt the minutes.
Fine. Unless we have a complaint from the mover, I think we have a motion on the table. All right, so let's do this by roll.
Ava Community Energy. Howard, I think for this purposes, I think you should be allowed to.
Okay,
no.
then in that case, aye.
Thank you. 3CE,
Yes.
Clean Power SF,
Yes,
Peninsula Clean Energy. Do we have Peninsula? No, we do not. Absent. Redwood Coast.
Yes.
Thank you, Lori. I don't believe we have San Jose. Am I correct in that? Silicon Valley Clean Energy,
Yes.
Sonoma Clean Power,
Yes.
and Valley Clean Energy.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. So that brings us to our regular calendar, and I don't know if we have a caller in yet. Do we have a certain former general counsel on the phone yet? Alex is nodding yes.
Yeah, we do. Amy, if possible, can we bring Brittany in? Former General Counsel Brittany Isles has joined. So Chair Cyphers, maybe you could kick things off and then I'm happy to jump in as well.
Well, we're sad and happy for you, Brittany, but we understand you're moving on. And so I just want to personally thank you for being so supportive and helpful in launching CC Power and being a really reliable, steady source of good advice and just calm energy, which is always great in a chaotic industry like the energy market. So I'll turn it over to GM Morris.
Well, hi, Brittany. Thank you. I just wanted to I appreciate you dialing in. I know you're moving and in the middle of moving to Seattle. And of course, we all wish you great luck. But I wanted to say it was a great privilege to have our paths cross in our career. And I'm so thankful on behalf of myself and CC Power for how you helped us in many ways, including herding cats with a lot of extremely valuable institutional memory, and then your innate problem solving skills and legal counsel. So just want to say you get a great A+ job, and I'm really sad to see you leave, but I know you'll do great things. And I wanted to make sure other board members had a chance to recognize and thank you. So thanks for dialing in today.
Anyone else want to go ahead?
I just wanted to, thank Alex for giving me this opportunity to express my appreciation for CC Power Board and the board. You all have been an amazing board to work with, and I feel very privileged to have seen CC Power grow over the past couple of years, and I'm just really excited to see how it continues to grow and evolve. So thank you all very much.
We got 3 more people who want to add on. So Monica.
Brittany, congratulations. I've enjoyed working with you so much. I know we got to work very closely together on the development of some of the agreements that we have for the projects. So I got working knowledge of Brittany, and then I've got Brittany at this level too. Both levels impressed me, and I wish you nothing but luck. I too hope that our paths cross at some time. And I feel bad for Tony having lost you. Tony, you have a hard time filling Brittany's shoes.
Here, here. All right, Director Hale.
Just more of the same, I guess. Brittany, thank you for your service. Really appreciate what you've done to help us stand up this organization, and I wish you luck in your next, in your Seattle endeavors. Thank you for doing what you've done for us.
And Director Sears.
Yeah, just to add similar thoughts, Brittany, thanks very much. It's not always easy to be general counsel for an existing organization, but a brand new one that adds layers of challenge. So thanks for that. And it's also not always easy to operate within the public sector. So thanks for that. And hopefully things get a lot easier for you now that you're going to the private sector. So good luck with that.
Thank you all for weighing in. Any more parting shots, Brittany?
Well, Mr. Chair, if I might, just for
Oh, please.
quick moment, I don't know if the board recognizes, but perhaps you do, how much into the deep end we threw Brittany on this task, and she handled it with such aplomb. And from whether it was the tasks that Monica was directly involved in the beginning and shepherding all the approval processes and the you know, the more recent times and the pickup of activity, her not only her legal judgment, but just general horse sense has been greatly appreciated. So I think you are right, Barbara. We are not going to be able to replace her, but we are going to move forward and serve our clients as best we can.
Thanks. Any parting shots, Brittany?
Yeah, I'll just say thank you again. It's truly been a wonderful experience working with you all. So I very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Enjoy Seattle. We'll bug you when we're up there next. All right. So we will move to the general manager's report, item 6B. So take it away, GM Morris.
Okay, hey everybody, welcome. It's great to have everyone here in an October where it's actually slightly raining in Sacramento. So there is a sign of the ending of this long summer. And it's kind of timely because what I wanted to do first is take you through numerous updates, including a quick look ahead at what's coming down the pike for Q4. And then we'll jump into a few specific updates. And as usual, I welcome discussion. We also will have some additional board discussion on some other separate items. So if appropriate, if discussion comes up, we'll kick it to the proper agenda item. So with that, Amy, please share the slides when you have a chance. And Amy, if there's some IT issue, I'm happy to try to share from my screen as well, if that would help. You can, okay. So we're in October, how time flies. And believe it or not, you know, I realize we're almost to the 1-year mark for our second full-time employee, Philippe, here. So, you know, it's neat. Philippe will be joining, or he's here as well. So he'll pop in as well for the meeting. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So I just want to give you a look at the work schedule. There is a lot of stuff coming, including some decision points. So I wanted the board looped in on that. This really just shows the next 4 months, and then across these columns, some of the core work streams that are underway. And so on the board activities, obviously we have meetings, and I do expect we will have the meetings through the end of the year and into January. The meeting dates for 2025 are not set, and we usually set those in December. So I do have the third Wednesday calendared there for you at January 15th. Also, when we get into the new year, you'll see that we plan to restart the work planning and budget process. You may recall it came down to the wire a little bit this year. It was our first year with this more comprehensive process that involved a lot of interviews and surveys. So we may do some of the legwork for that early in December so that we hit the ground running in the new year and have a timely and smooth budget approval process. Also, in only about 2 weeks, we have, or slightly under 2 weeks, we have the Fall Forum, which is a sort of education event for the board members to come together, and will be hosted in a couple facilities in Davis. I'll talk more about that. And thanks in advance to Director Sears for hosting and helping arrange this. We were going to give you a briefing later on the build transfer RFP, and you'll know that this has taken a lot of work, and all 9 of our CCA members are participating. So we're now down to the point of shortlisting and then pending sufficient interest entering into exclusivity agreements. And from there, we'll go into a discussion of the next step, which we've been calling the phase 2B. And that's where we really work to get into the contract, and then members will have the choice to sign on. And so we sort of eyeballing it, we do think we'll be considering the phase 2B pretty soon, probably in November. And then we'll see how long it takes to get into finish the final contracting phase, which would be the go, no go into the phase 3 eventually. On the RA Power Pool, this is something we've been working on. And as you all recall, we look at an idea through these strategic assessments. On the RA Power Pool, we're actually doing 2 strategic assessments. So we're going to give you a briefing on it, which is really on strategic assessment 1 that shows some of the benefits and some of the design ideas for this RA Power Pool. And then we're also undertaking strategic assessment 2, which is a more detailed and portfolio specific look at the possible values from participating in a multi-member, matchmaking power pool. We hope to have that wrapped up by November. And my hope is that your staff and then you also will be on a path where you're ready and comfortable to make some version of a go, no go decision towards the end of the year, potentially in December. Moving right along on Cottimo, and I'll talk more about this, but just want you to know there's an in-person meeting on the 13th. It's coming up, and I will speak more about it. And then that will probably position us to wrap up phase 1 work and see if there's interest in phase 2 work. And then lastly, on trainings, we have the anti-market manipulation training now available. And we also are working to get the other trainings finalized and online. And those would be the Grid 101, 201, and then the CCA 101 trainings. And the vision for those trainings is they're a tool in your toolkit, potentially for newer board members or for new staff as appropriate. And then I guess really quick on CC Power operations, we've been undertaking this long and extensive revamp of some of our IT file sharing and security protocols. We're getting that finalized, and then we're going to post our next position, and then we're probably going to have a project manager start towards the end of the year. And that project manager will be working with Philippe on the power management side. Director Padilla, glad to have a question. Please go ahead.
Yes, first, I appreciate this format. It's very nice to see it all kind of laid out here for the different kind of functional areas. I had a question about the board activities. At what point do we make assignments to, I think there's a couple of subcommittees at the board. I think there's a budget one and maybe an executive one. When does that happen on the calendar?
Great question. My understanding is we appoint new officers. We elect officers in January for the 12 months of the year. And there's even consideration about considering doing 2-year terms, if that makes sense. And so that's something we would have to bring to the board for discussion. And then for the budget committee, we haven't enacted any official policy. What I do plan to do in December, though, is get a sort of timeline project plan. And as you and I discussed last year, it may help to have some version of a budget committee, whether it's Brown Act or an ad hoc, still TBD, but that would allow board members to really get into the guts of the budgeting process a little more in a way that could be beneficial. And so, Director Padilla, if it's okay, I'd close the loop with you in December on that, assuming we still have time. And if you want to chat sooner, I welcome that. On that note, Director Padilla, I also attended 3CE's budget approval meeting where they have a very slick, sort of multi-page magazine on the budget, and I thought that was a good way to provide a lot of additional information on it. Monica, we have another hand raised, but if you have any follow-ups, please chime in now. Okay. Director Hale, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm wondering, now that you've brought up the topic of the budget and planning for that, if the committee and or the treasurer, Director Sears, could add insight at some point into how is spending of reserves controlled? I noted in the earlier item on the agenda that reserves are building, which is great. I'm not sure what the board's policy is on, once funds get allocated there, my expectation would be they are somewhat restricted in their use without some additional step. And I'm not sure, as the budget process has evolved, whether that's been nailed down yet. So maybe that's just a question that can be put in the parking lot and addressed at a subsequent time.
Great point. I've taken a note, and I'll work with Director Sears on that. Director Hale, just a quick note, in the consent agenda, we presented, and you've now received the unaudited 23-24 fiscal year financials. The plan we've had all along, this is in the memo, was to try and build reserves over perhaps 4 years, and the reserve goal we were eyeballing was about 6 months worth of reserves, mostly focused on the G&A side of the budget.
Right.
For project specific reserves, that's usually determined within the project itself, so we don't really have to plan for that from the budgeting standpoint so much. I think you raise a great point, Director Hale, that the rules for when and if and how we would dip into the reserves don't exist right now. Generally, the plan is that all that we're in a reserve build. So what you'll see from our most recent fiscal year was, we built faster than we expected. So it's probably a good outcome. And then I'll work with Treasurer Sears on sort of doing a paper trail to follow up on sort of designating those as reserves, which is what I would recommend. So
my suggestion on that matter would be to just ask 2 or 3 of us for our own policies about reserves, and just don't reinvent the wheel, and just, bring a draft that might be informed by some of that. I think that our own policies are probably policies we could live with. So.
Okay. That sounds great.
And then yes, that's a great suggestion. And then the further thought I would also offer is that, to the extent we are building reserves at a faster pace than we expected, I would hope that would mean we would that would be reflected in any fees that are set for the members.
Indeed, when we set dues in the annual budgeting process, and that is one of the controls we have, Director Hale, to make sure we don't dip into the reserves as sort of the authorized spending plan of the budget. But you raise a good point that once we've achieved reserves, currently the G&A invoices include that reserve build goal. So at some point, when we have sufficient reserves, we would not expect that to be in there, and that could look something like reduced G&A. Although I don't want to guarantee. I don't know where we'll be yet.
Yeah, and what I was thinking in particular is that we don't need to collect at the same levels if we are ahead of our pace, so that the fact that we are ahead of pace may moderate what the dues increases would be.
Understood.
Yeah.
That'll be a great thing to consider for budgeting next year. On that same note, at the bottom, you see this additional Q4 work. There's still a bunch of other stuff. So I wanted to just notify you that we may do some select project invoicing, and we may have a couple projects come up. Around this time a year ago, multiple members joined in sort of bulk purchases or bulk buys of some data and information, and then also a report and we'll be returning to the resource planning working group with those opportunities. And then on some of the projects, this will really be one of the first times you're seeing how we roll forward your project balances, and that then counts against any sort of need to invoice you in future years. So this is all in the consent agenda item, but you can actually see each specific project balancing account. Now, some of them went down to zero, but that's okay. We're not tight on cash. And so you'll see on the balancing accounts that still have some sort of revenue balance, that would, in theory, offset any future invoicing amounts. And we'll try to make that really clear for everybody when we issue those invoices. Okay. All right. So their last item is the power project oversight, which of course is one of our top priorities, and there's a lot going on there, and we'll brief you later. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to jump down to the Central Coast and focus for a minute on the Kadamo project. And you'll recall the sort of southerly point here is a inflection point known to be the sort of divide between Northern and Southern California called Point Conception. And you can see these 4 turbines on this map. That's off the Vandenberg Space Force Base, and that's the site for the Kadamo project. This is an area about 200 feet deep water, maybe deeper, and it would require 4 floating offshore wind turbines. The turbines would be sized at the sort of existing available turbine size. And there's a couple neat interconnection paths to be considered, including dropping some of the potential wind energy off at the base and then moving it to the grid or direct connects to the grid. So we want to have a collaboration meeting. And we also see that the state may have interest in this because if CC Power and members do end up moving forward and helping this project become a reality, there's some data that shows you get a lot of learning value from it. And when we did some calculations about learning now before the state may or may not procure thousands of megawatts of offshore wind, what you see is that even modest learning value could yield billions of dollars in savings. So we're thinking the state may have an interest in understanding this project more and maybe collaborating with us or supporting us as some sort of investment in offshore wind. None of that is really defined, although we do have an MOU with Kadamo, and the next step on the next slide is to have an in-person get together. We're calling a collaboration meeting, where we want to start to talk with a group of stakeholders about these matters simultaneously. And we think this could be helpful for building the right type of collaborative environment and getting facts about how this could be valuable out. Amy, if you don't mind, next slide. Oh, thank you. Got it. Yeah, and so at this meeting, which is on November 13th, it's going to be in person in Lompoc, California, in the territory of 3CE. So Rob, thanks for hosting. And although it's at the Hilton Garden Inn, but so the attendees will be the Kadamo team, some CCAs, CC Power, the Chumash tribe, and maybe some other tribes, labor, and there may be a couple different angles of labor in the room. The Space Force Base staff or staffers, some key staff from the CEC and CPUC, PG&E, some local officials, and others. We have an agenda for this, and I welcome any board members to attend, notwithstanding any concern about having a quorum. And if you're really interested, also, your staff is welcome to attend. So please email Shagan at her CC Power address, and we'll get you plugged in. As part of this, we also have checked in with the Department of Water Resources, which will be the central procurement entity, and the governor's offshore wind team. They both are the key staff there are literally unavailable on vacation, but they're in the loop here, and I think understand what we're trying to do. So we'll close the loop with them afterwards. So I welcome any questions on this before we move on.
I see Director Shaw.
Thank you, Chair Cypers. General Manager Morris, just one suggestion, maybe reaching out to the NOAA Office of National Marine Sanctuaries to invite them to attend. They may have some insights about the advisory council process for the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary that's, as you know, been recently approved. So just formally inviting them so that we're being respectful of that process might be a good step as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Director Shaw. We want to make sure everybody feels invited, and this is really a collaboration meeting. So even helping us avoid excluding anyone is really valuable and important at this time. Thank you.
And just noting Director Marshall joined the meeting is recently. Welcome. Director Chang.
Hi, excited to hear about this project. I don't have a lot of background on it, so apologies if I'm behind given my newer membership to this body. But just curious, the learnings that you referenced there, that as the objective or intent makes a lot of sense. But I am curious, how is it relatable or applicable to maybe the broader and larger scale offshore wind potential that California holds? Is this a similar technology? Is this a different technology explicitly? Does this have any interconnection learnings that would be relatable to a much larger scale build out, or logistics learnings, things like that? That would be the intent of such a sort of smaller scale offshore wind project.
Yeah, great question, Director Chang. Thank you. So this is floating, just like the big ones will be. The big ones are, call it 20 to 30 miles offshore in 2,000 feet deep water, I believe, whereas this is 200 feet, but still a full-size floating turbine, typically with 3 cables going down to anchor it. This one is in only California state waters, whereas the others are in federal waters. But in any case, you always have to go through a complicated permitting process, both through the state water zone and then onto the shore. So you'll be bringing a lot of the right agencies together to sort of work through the permitting for the first time, work through some of the environmental monitoring. Another key factor about this project is it can come online sooner, and it is in the interconnection queue, whereas some of the other offshore wind is contemplated, but not sort of as near term available, and it's not in the interconnection queue. So we see this as a chance to really get something online sooner that could materially inform everybody. And then lastly, Director Chang, based on build outs from the Welsh coast, they saw cost declines that they attributed to learning, I think in the order of 10 to 15%. So we sort of approximated our analysis using that data point, and it showed that, depending on how big the state goes, there could be, dozens of billions of dollars in cost savings here. So it quickly gets very material, and we think there's a good reason for the state to be supportive and interested.
Let's go to Director Padilla.
Yeah, I think it's not a surprise that there's a lot of skepticism about offshore wind, given the cost and the complexity and all the hurdles and stuff. And I do appreciate opportunities to learn. I also understand that CC Power's investment in this CATMO has been pretty minimal in terms, mostly staff time, not a whole lot of dollars. But at some point, there will be some dollars associated with it. And I guess will be on every member to decide whether they want to kind of put money forward to continue to move this ball. But big picture, if we get to that point where we have all member support or a significant amount of member support to move this along the phase process, and then it fails, what do you see that the risks are of that happening, and how do you think that might impact CC Power?
That's something we should consider. And to your first point, Director Padilla, the possible go no go into a phase 2 here, where people would pony up the next amount of interest and funding could be as soon as later this year. I think phase 2 would be where we work with members who are actively interested and want to be offtake, and we see if there's a possible deal there. And I think that would be the time where a lot of the risks are truly assessed. I really can't evaluate those risks, and I'm not much of an expert, but what we're trying to do with this is build a sufficient record for you guys to make a decision on a go, no go to a phase 2. And so that's why we're teeing this up before we bring the phase 2 decision, because we think there'll be a lot of learning and a little more visibility into whether there's good alignment among stakeholders or not. And that'll inform perhaps how challenging it'll be to find a way for this project to become reality. Hopefully that helps. I'm happy to chime in more. Director Sears, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, just register our support for the idea of a proof of concept, because there are a lot of unknowns, and there's a lot of eggs being put into this basket. It seems like it would be prudent for us and for the state to learn more about it through a smaller scale project. So while I realize that there are a number of potential pitfalls here, this is one of the reasons why, as a reminder, we formed CC Power in the first place, to be able to take on these types of questions and look at these types of opportunities and make an informed decision about whether or not this is something that we as individual CCAs or collectively as a group think are worth pursuing. So just wanted to chime in that way, that I think that these preliminary steps, I think, are really important, and the way that you're mapping them out, I think, makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Yeah.
Director Sears, you speak my mind to a significant degree, and I'll add, I think the learnings that we could get from this are not just for our benefit, they're for DWR and for the state of California more broadly. So I think that means a lot to me.
Yeah, and just to give you a sense of some of the learning, there's a lot of lingo around ports and jobs that is associated with offshore wind, but you really look at these sort of assembly ports called staging and integration ports, and then you have these operations and maintenance ports. And then you even have smaller ports where you can have smaller boats that transit people to and fro the sites for construction monitoring, other work. So even there, in trying to understand the port plan, what I learned on the trip to the East Coast is there's a lot of noise in how this stuff develops, and you still will have a free market occurring as parties move into the space and try to fill jobs, or fishermen or wharf spaces pivot to try and do this. And so this project will help energize and start some of that work, which on the East Coast seems to be a big part of how the market matured over 20 years. So I am confident that learning will help local groups orient on this and find pathways to benefit, while also just sort of broadly moving the industry forward and giving us big single project experience. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Thanks everybody for the great questions, and happy to follow up. All right, I'm very excited for our fall forum. It's coming up in about 13 days, or no, 12 days. And so this is a chance for us to come together. We'll be hosted at the UC Davis Energy and Efficiency Institute, which does have a tour about heat pumps, which I know heat pumps are so hot right now. And then, so we'll have a day of sort of sessions focused on some forward-looking planning, thinking of ourselves as co-ops and seeing what insights that yields, or what information we may learn from other co-ops, which have their whole arsenal of resources through Enrica. We'll have a dinner with special guests, and then some tours that can be available. So it's going to be a full day, but also a chance for everybody to participate and offer ideas. And there will not be any board action, but we do plan to notice this in case we get any public attendees. And so it starts at 9:30, and then we have dinner around 5:30 that goes to 8. And then the assumption is many of you, or some of you, may from there head to Sacramento because of the Cal CCA CMUA event the following day. So we've tried to sequence it usefully with Cal CCA. And specifically on the forward-looking planning, we'll talk a little bit about the strategic plan in a moment, but this is a chance for us to start warming up on a strategic plan refresh that I think will be really helpful, and will build alignment for all of us on what we want CC Power to be growing towards. And so I'll speak to that in a moment. But before I do that, Director Sears, anything you'd like to add about the beauty of Yolo County and what we're about to experience here?
Well, thanks, Alex. Yeah, we're looking forward to hosting everyone. There is, I think, some pretty interesting, parts of the tour on UC Davis, and then looking forward to having a chance to interact with some of the guests during dinner, and then transitioning into the next couple of days in Sacramento. So hopefully it works out for everybody's schedule, and very much looking forward to hosting everyone.
Great. All right, any questions, or we'll move on? Okay. Excellent. And again, thanks for letting me go through this detailed update. So I wanted to start this strategic planning refresh conversation with everybody at this time. What Philippe and I have found working with Tony and his team and the board and the staff is that everybody's interested in CC Power being successful. But sometimes it would help if we had a little more clarity on and comfort with what CC Power is doing and when. And so what we propose to do here is we're going to take the 2022 strategic plan, which was really a 3-year look ahead. And believe it or not, we're almost into 2025, right? So that was the end of that strategic plan. And we wanted to get a new look going. And this new longer term strategic plan would link up and perhaps guide or seriously guide and dictate what our annual work planning and budgeting process looked like. And some of the tools we'll use are to sort of crowdsource some ideas and thinking from you and get on the same page with language. We'll start some of that at the offsite, and then we'll use member interviews and other approaches. And in the end, the hope is that the board may be in a position to adopt a revised strategic plan that provides more planning and visibility to our members, further aligns us on the desired CC Power capabilities and on member participation. And then it also may help with multi-year budgeting, which could be another thing to smooth operations a little bit. So I'm excited about this, and I do think it's helpful. And I go back to the strategic plan quite often to make sure I'm sort of tracking the agency towards what the board had directed. And so far, so good, but I think it's time to revisit it. Any questions on this? Okay, then one last GM update. This is my chance to disclose any contracts we signed pursuant to the GM's signing authorization. And the only contract in this period was we have extended Shagun's contract. As many of you know, Shagun has helped in so many ways. And so she was on a pure hourly contract, and we shifted her to a retainer model that then gives us an hourly rate if she works a lot within a certain month. So I'm very pleased with this and excited to have Shagun on. And this also stabilizes us and eases the need to add more resources on an FTE basis. So this is a little more flexible, and I think probably better for the agency at this time. The not to exceed on that contract is $90K. Okay, so with that, back to you, Chair Cyphers, and thank you for the opportunity to update everyone.
Thank you so much. So we'll move to 6C on new member considerations. And what I'd like to propose today, so we have three CCAs that have expressed some interest recently in joining CC Power. And when we met with the executive committee, we talked about this, and I think we've got tentative alignment that we want to work toward asking the board to consider these applications, but we've also identified some potential needs for considering refining and maybe finalizing some of our policies and practices before expanding very much. And so this is just coming from XCOM. This is not a board direction or action. But for today, what I would propose is that I provide some examples of the concerns that bubbled up for us, and ask you all between this meeting and next to do a little homework to read through, and we'll make sure GM Morris sends out an email with this in writing, to think through, are there any other matters we ought to discuss and hash out before growing too much further, knowing, at least it's my prejudice, that the larger we are, potentially the harder it is to make adjustments to policies and practices. And so no need to take notes. I do want to read a few example concerns, but I'll make sure the General Manager Morris sends this out by email. So a few of the ones that have come up for me are, how would CC Power navigate a member that doesn't have the resources or desire to serve on the board? Would we consider a different category of membership? And I think so far that's an unanswered question. Another is, how would CC Power consider a member that cannot contribute expert procurement staff to CC Power's procurement efforts? Maybe due to a lack of having that kind of expert staff on their team. Third one would be like, what adjustments to CC Power's capabilities or processes would be needed to ensure that members prefer to procure resources through CC Power and not choose to run parallel solicitations for similar resources? And to date, I think we've been a little bit lucky in navigating parallel procurement without conflicts. But I am imagining that if that became commonplace, it could eventually lead to some conflicts and challenges. And so one of the questions around that for me is like, what would you want CC Power to develop as far as capacity and timing and track record, et cetera, to convince you that when CC Power is going to go out with a solicitation, that you don't also run or don't want to run a parallel solicitation for the same kind of resource. I think that kind of feedback could be really valuable at this stage of our development. Another one is, are there member agreement considerations that still need to be resolved? We've just all executed a member agreement, although I did so while noting that there was a very small matter, but kind of important, that the member agreement doesn't have any specificity to the timeline of a hold period for a project. And you all may have identified a couple things like that. So is there a second round to that conversation that ought to happen before we expand membership? And so those are just examples, but I think they were sufficient in my mind and in the minds of some others to kind of want to crowdsource this group on kind of what have we missed? What kind of refinements to those steering questions should we make? And I see Director Padilla with a hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, those are all really good points, and we certainly have had them ourselves at SBCE, not with respect to new member consideration, just in general. And I almost suggested when General Manager Morris was going through his upcoming activities, that one of the items that we put on the board activities for some point is some of those governance issues, because it is a problem and is a problem at our size, and it certainly will be a problem if we grow even more. Things that I would appreciate getting resolution with or without adding additional members. And I don't know when that's going to happen, quite frankly. So,
well, what I would commit to is encouraging this body to take it up expeditiously. I think this is timely because if we tell applicants that we don't have an answer and we let that go on for too many months or years, it's not really very responsive to them. So what I'd like to do, hopefully with this board's support, is start agendizing some of those discussions, to your point, and just start making progress so that at least we can maybe over the course of a few months start thinking about timelines that make sense for considering membership, that are specific and concrete, so that we can say yes or no as opposed to we don't know. That's my leaning, at least.
I would support that very much, and I think it also aligns a little bit with the strategic plan or this work plan effort that was discussed. You know, in my mind, the procurement that we would have done through CC Power is that makes sense, that we can't do on our own. And so, you know, going back to kind of the basics about why we formed CC Power, making sure that that's still, you know,
sure,
vision.
Good. All right, let's go to Director Hale.
Thank you. You know, when I read the memo in the packet from the GM on this, one of the things I kind of thought of as a baseline principle, and some of the items that you brought up, Jeff, indicates that maybe we're on opposite ends of this spectrum. So we could have a rich conversation, I'm sure, is as a basic principle that there be no free ridership. I think that's something that I'm interested in achieving. And that for me, that would also include, as we build reserves, a new member joining, making a contribution to reserves, even if that's on like a payment plan basis, so that we maintain sort of the equal level of financial commitment that we've all put in so far.
We've got a good track record of that through the financing authority, where new members who join that financing authority have to kind of pay the fair share of prior costs and have a fee. And so I'm guessing that would resonate. It certainly does for me. So
Okay.
I'll turn to, and by the way, this is really good, and I want to do a few minutes of this kind of discussion. I also think this is so meaty that I don't want to have any expectation that we finish it in a live meeting. So if you think of something 2 hours from now, don't worry. What we want to do is set up a written method for you to get General Manager Morris feedback following the meeting and before the next, so that we can capture things in writing and get it detailed, because this is important stuff. So let's see. General Manager Morris, do you have something before I go to the next?
Just a bit of nuance here. So, Director Hale, I hear you. We actually do have a policy that allows us to consider individual members one at a time. And it does require that they contribute upfront 2 years worth of the reserve building goals. So we have addressed that through a sort of single policy. And I think what is helpful is we had numerous parties ask for membership all at once, and it sort of raises this prospect of quick growth. And so the policies under consideration, if I'm not putting words in Chair Cypher's mouth, are, really these tricky governance one. It's not so much the one-off ask for a member to be considered. It's really, are we ready, is how I'm understanding it, Director Cyphers. So I think it's really great to think through these policies, and you'll actually see a policy later today that might fall into this category of one of the things we should have worked out before we have more members joining. So, so back to you, Director Cyphers. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, and just not to be cryptic, that's relating to the default project allocation policy. So I saw Director Marshall.
Okay, thank you very much. I do want to just agree with Director Hale's general comment about no free ridership, and it seems like we're on the right track with respect to that. I also am very appreciative that you all are thinking about sort of the guidelines and thresholds, be it financial, staff capability, all of those things. I don't know where the sort of Northern California, Southern California, SoCal Edison overlay comes into this discussion, and whether or not that turns out to be a helpful thing for us or something that is, for lack of a better term, a distraction. And then overall, though, however, I do think that the ethos of CCA has been, for Lothi's, more than 10 years now, that we band together, right? And we bring others along, and we find a way to support CCAs and for all of us to be successful without free ridership. So in general, I'm glad that we're going to give it a close look with potentially a favorable view. The last thing I just want to say, and I think maybe this is just an opportunity to reframe the question, but also I think for General Manager Morris to drill down. Jeff, you made a statement, or one of your questions was, what would it take for, forgive me, I'm paraphrasing, but something like, what would it take for your CCA to prefer to procure through CC Power in an effort, I think, to avoid bumping into each other or competing, right? And that's a tricky one, right? Because so many of us have been here for a long time. We have very robust teams and portfolios and all of that. And so what I might ask is a better understanding of under what conditions, under what circumstances would you choose to procure through CC Power versus going your own way? And what are some of the, and from CC Power's perspective, what are some of those sort of requests or mitigations that we should be thinking about? So I think that question right there is pretty central. At least it is for PCE, and General Manager Morris knows this. But I think with new CCAs coming on, if they do, and some of them are newer, that may be a more relevant question. So I don't know, but I feel like if we can tease that one out, to me, that is pretty core to our membership and the mission of the organization. So stop there. Thank you.
Super. And I think that that's the kind of structural input that I'm looking for, which is, it's a meaty question. It's not
Yeah.
simple. It's got a lot of dimensions. If we can't resolve that, or if we can't agree on, how to reach a preference for CC Power to do procurement, how do we safeguard against suing each other because we're stepping on each other's toes? Like, I don't want to get to that point, right? So,
Right.
so like, let's at least tackle the whole problem. So anyway, Director Chang.
To Director Padilla's point, go back to the original kernel, the seed for CC Power, which I believe before my time, but I believe it was really focused on long duration storage and wind. And not necessarily competing on all the different resources. So maybe I need to come up to speed on that, but it does seem like there's been a broadening of that activity.
Before I go to Director Chang, my memory is different. So that was, and others can correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is that the purpose of CC Power was to do any and all joint action that involved many CCAs, like more than two, and to facilitate that kind of work. And so the convenience of taking on risky and complex projects where no one of us might want to be the sole off-taker, I think was at the heart of it.
Okay.
And another value proposition in my mind was to send a very strong signal to the legislature and the regulators that we had the capability to procure multi-billion-dollar resources, and that we didn't necessarily need an IOU to go do that for us. And so, and pooling our credit capacity has really facilitated that in a way.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So I'll go to Director Chang.
Thank you. I'll just echo that last point of I'm interested in maybe delving into the objectives and strategy of this body a little bit further to understand, is it, because I've heard some mixed things around, using CC Power to contract projects that we otherwise would not do. Either it's because it's a new technology or it's a different scale. But I also get the sense that we're doing some traditional projects, and there are certainly members of various sizes where there may be different benefits or goals that the CCA is seeking from an entity like this. And one of the fundamental questions I ask myself as we consider new membership is bigger better? Does that provide us some greater influence, greater capabilities to procure differently than otherwise? But I also fully support that there are some smaller CCAs, and absolutely jointly procuring has a very significant benefit, and I think we as a JPA want to support that need as well. So I'll just highlight and echo that need. Maybe that's a topic we speak to further in the in-person meeting, or maybe it's a separately agendized topic. And then I guess two other quick things. Or really one big thing I want to highlight is on this idea of no free riders. We talked about a little bit as it relates to from a financial perspective, but I'll just also say from a procurement support perspective, I think that's an important way to think about it, both in terms of CCAs supporting CC Power's efforts, whether it be a CCA volunteering for a particular RFO and taking a significant role in the negotiations or the evaluation process, but also this is an avenue for CC Power and the collective of these CCAs to, I think, perhaps help provide some support to newer CCAs, smaller CCAs that may not have as deep of a staff to also learn about some procurement best practices and things like that. I see that kind of going both ways as a benefit. So I just wanted to call that out and note that I think we have an interest with NABA to think about how we can support the RFO and the negotiation process, whatever it may be in the future in a different way. And then the other thing, just closing a point on the financial pieces, I will highlight for not just financial, but the governance piece. For CCCFA, there are different types of members. There's associate members and there's founding members or voting members. So just want to throw that out there for consideration as we talked about, the challenges of governance as the group expands. And so that may be something that we want to actively consider here. And maybe that consideration or that, difference in voting is applied differently depending on the type of procurement that's happening, a more traditional procurement versus a novel procurement or something like that. So just want to throw that out there.
That was really good input. Thank you. Director Hale.
Just a final observation that I think some of what we are talking about here isn't new member consideration issues, but is strategic planning and broader considerations that as a board we should be thinking about, and General Manager Morris has already put on the docket for consideration for us. So that's good.
Super. I think this has been rich enough that it got us started. So what I'm going to do is ask General Manager Morris to maybe capture a few of the comments that got made today, and then some of the comments that I shared as well, and get that out by email and invite members to communicate back with you more questions, more challenges, maybe more of the substantive, meaty dialogue we should be having. Maybe that's the core question we should be asking, is like, what conversations are we willing to make time to have? And go from there. And so I think, unless there's objection, I would move on to the next item, but I will check for public comment for doing that. There's no action on this. Is there any public comment? I'm not seeing hands. Okay, so let's go on to the build transfer item. So 6D.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Amy, would you mind bringing the slides back up, please? Great, thank you. Move to the next slide. So we just recently were able to receive the results of our solicitation. We've done our evaluation and qualitative assessments of the projects that were bid into that solicitation. So we were quite pleased with the turnout from the development community within our efforts here. On the next slide, I'll share more information about the numbers of offers that we received by different technologies and between binding offers and more of like an RFI track relating to QC15 projects. We are currently in the process of working with your staff to identify what projects are of interest to further explore and potentially enter into exclusivity agreements with. Part of the process associated with shortlisting these projects, we will be engaging our owner's engineer, Panorama Energy Partners, to do a deep dive technical analysis on the projects, particularly the build transfer projects, to ensure that we understand any potential risks that there might be if we do wish to move forward with the purchase of that project. And we've also asked them to already start looking at least one project that we might consider for entering into negotiations for a PPA on. We also have been able to move forward with the execution on the member participation agreement. So this is a great step forward for us to ensure that we're able to get information from the members about what their needs might be, and also to be able to put in place those hold periods associated with any of the resources that are under active consideration by CC Power. There was a comment raised earlier about what the duration of those holds should be. Our intent ultimately is to try to minimize the time associated with those holds. And so we are trying to move quickly through the review process with your staff to understand where there are projects that are truly of interest for you all to participate in through CC Power. So we may release the remaining projects for further consideration. And if there happens to be overlap with ongoing solicitations that you all have, there would be no conflicts with the member participation agreement. We also are putting forward the member default project allocation policy for consideration and approval today. We'll get into that in a moment, but ultimately this is intended to help resolve any potential conflicts around where there may be more interest in participating in a project than available supply from that project. And how do we fairly allocate capacity amongst the members to ensure that everybody is able to participate and realize the benefits of those projects that we have solicited. We're simultaneously continuing to have Latham & Watkins move forward with the development of our build transfer pro forma agreement. We had launched the solicitation with a term sheet, given the timing considerations to be able to launch that solicitation ahead of the deadlines for QC15 points allocations, and with the intent that we wanted to move forward with the selection of projects this year. We are also working with Braun Blazing on the development of what we're terming a power sales agreement. We're starting with a term sheet, and the intent of this agreement is really to consider what offtake mechanisms are going to exist between members and a CC Power owned project. We're going to need this agreement in order to be able to have CC Power go out and issue bonds for the purchase of the project, which would then be underpinned by your offtake from CC Power and your ability to collect from your customers the rates required to pay for the ongoing offtake under those agreements. As far as next steps that we're looking at, we have asked by today to get all of the feedback from members on which projects they want to pick up within the RFP track. And by Friday, we're looking for information back from you all and your staff about which projects we're going to take within or seek QC15 points to be allocated to, based upon indicative expressions of interest. And we would ideally look to move forward with shortlisting the projects, although it does look like there might have to be further dialogue amongst the various members to help hone in which projects ultimately have enough of a quorum of members' interest to ultimately select and move forward with exclusivity. We'll go to the next slide, please. So now we'll move into the RFP results. And Tony, might I ask you to just give a quick disclaimer about discussion around confidential market sensitive information and so forth?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that, strictly speaking, CC Power is a public agency. The members are all public agencies. The briefings and the statements of antitrust policy that you get, for example, in Cal CCA meetings aren't strictly applicable, but nevertheless, it is wise to think about these things. Any issues associated with sharing of confidential information, particularly pricing or other sensitive information, may run afoul of a state or federal antitrust or business practice laws, and as such, we strive to keep those materials in strictest confidence.
Great, thank you. We'll move to the next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, we were quite pleased with the turnout within the solicitation. We ultimately had 34 unique developer counterparties participate in that solicitation, resulting in 80 offers for binding offtake and 61 offers down the RFI track, where developers were looking for CC Power members to allocate commercial interest points in the CAISO's QC15 TBD allocation study. We got only 5 build transfer offers, so this was a little bit less than what we had hoped for. There were a few developers that we have been engaging with that ultimately did not participate. And so some of that seems to have been related to like staff turnover and other issues, but at any rate, we do have a couple projects that we are currently doing further diligence on, which we'll speak about in just a moment. Within the RFP, we did get 2 wind offers. So that was one of the key deliverables that members were seeking from us, were to solicit for build transfer projects for wind and geothermal projects. And then we sought to get competitive pricing for solar plus storage and standalone storage PPAs and tolls, so that we could compare them against the comparative build transfer pricing that we were being able to realize. Ultimately, we did not get any geothermal binding offers. We did get 1 expression of interest from a geothermal developer who wished to pursue more of like a cost plus arrangement. And so we'll continue to have further dialogue with them. But then we did get quite substantial interest from developers pursuing solar plus storage and standalone storage projects. Ultimately, we wanted to be able to present all of the information to your staff before and get feedback as to whether there might be interest in participating in any of these PPAs or tolls through CC Power, recognizing that you all are also soliciting those same kinds of projects independently, and have those capabilities to procure those and fit them within your portfolios. So I think that was part of where there was potential conflicts and concerns around the role of the member participation agreement. But based upon the expressions of interest that we're seeing being provided by your staff, I feel like in general, those overlaps and considerations of potential conflict have largely been mitigated. We also got quite a few 8-hour lithium storage projects being bid to us, which was great for us to assess potential long duration storage procurement. We didn't get any pumped hydro binding offers per se, but we got 2 that did, or 3 that did participate through more of like a RFI process with indicative pricing for us to consider. But ultimately, given their long lead time natures, these projects will require to go through QC 16 most likely in order to get interconnected. We also then got 1 compressed air storage developer that participated, providing both offers for binding offtake as well as down the RFI track. So overall, pleased with the turnout. And then as we iterate and hopefully make this a recurring annual solicitation that we'll be running to ensure deal flow for members, we'll continue to take feedback from you and your staff as far as like what types of projects are of the most interest and try to avoid any potential conflicts where possible. And we'll move to the next slide, please. So as far as the build transfer offers that we received, we had 3 projects that ultimately kind of rose to the top of being of most interest to the members. We've removed the information that can specifically identify the developers in those projects for confidentiality purposes, but did want to share that in general, there's a decision that we have to make in a relatively short period of time as far as what sort of technology is of most interest for us to pursue on the build transfer. We can look at a solar plus storage project, we could look at a pumped hydro project, or we could look at a 8-hour lithium ion standalone battery project. Ultimately, we had not expected that the pumped hydro project would be within the same general time frame as other projects for consideration on build transfer, but considering some of the long development timelines required for interconnection and achievement of deliverability, we now have that as an alternative as compared to the other options that is on the table for us. Certain considerations here might also be around what the expected cost would be and how much debt would have to be issued in order to procure a share or a full ownership of one of these projects. The pumped hydro project, we expect will be significantly more expensive as a whole to purchase. And so there might be opportunities to buy into, say, a 50% share of that project, with the remainder either being procured by us under a toll or that we would only take that 50% share. The other projects that we have down here that are not in bold, one was a DG portfolio of standalone or solar plus storage projects located in various CCA member territories. Given concerns around being able to get deliverability, that was not moved forward for further consideration. And then we had a relatively immature pumped hydro project with behind the meter solar tied to it that would require a different risk profile if we do wish to consider that one. We have gotten additional information about the proposed pricing on it, so we are in the process of doing valuation and diligence on it and could consider it. But unlike the first 3 projects where we would be able to really defer to the developer to lead the development process and ultimately bring that project to COD when we would take an ownership interest in it, this project would require likely at least one FTE on CC Power staff in order to basically manage EPC and equipment selection, all of that, and help develop and mature this project, and would require interim milestone payments to help advance that. And then finally, there's another pumped hydro project, which also is quite immature, that is really somewhat too early for us to really consider at this time for potential ownership. But it is helpful for us to understand that it exists and that it is intending to be developed, so that we might consider how we might want a relationship with that developer into the future. So I'll pause there and see if there's any questions from anybody about any of the projects and the results of the solicitation.
Director Marshall.
Rich.
Thank you very much. Congratulations on such a robust response, first of all, and great job, team, for all of that. I do want to find out at what point, and maybe this is sort of the next piece of phase 2. When will you be bringing to us sort of a risk assessment, sort of a cost benefit analysis, not only around the project itself and the project specific details, but about the resource? And for full transparency, I'll just share that in conversations we've had and on our team, we are aware, because we're suffering a late COD on a lithium ion battery that, you know, has fire issues and yada yada. So, you know, there are, and I'm sure you all are aware of them, risks associated with some of these resources more than others. And so just the question, when will we sort of get into those details in terms of sifting and sorting what's realistic here? Thanks.
Yeah, good question. So we do have our owner's engineer currently undertaking their due diligence on these various projects to assess various development risks, counterparty risks, interconnection, permitting, equipment selection risks, supply chain, all of that. So we expect that they will have that complete in about 2 weeks, and we will be sharing that with your staff through our resource planning working group on what recommendations they have and the identified risks. We'll look to bring that information forward to the board for consideration before we would make any decision about which of these projects ultimately to move forward with into a phase 2B, where we would be seeking funds to start negotiations.
Right.
And at that point, we can also undertake a deeper dive diligence as necessary to further assess any further considerations in the negotiation process.
One consideration to Director Marshall's question that I have a plea to all of us to consider is going through this process. Our team found that having a transmission planner on staff that had a full transmission model of California operating in our shop was really, really important for us to assess the risks of each of these projects and provide that to CC Power. I'm expecting that kind of skill set is going to grow in value over the coming decade, not shrink. So any of you who already have robust analytics teams, I would recommend shopping PJM and MISO and other footprints. Probably, I don't know about ERCOT, but for transmission planners, and get them over to California. So anyway, I'll move on to Director Padilla.
Yes, echo what Director Marshall said in terms of congratulations for the very kind of successful RFO that was run by CC Power. You know, we do have an RFO out ourselves, as do other CCAs. So we're trying to balance, you know, what we need to procure for our purposes versus what we want to engage with CC Power. The timing couldn't have been any worse, but here we are. In terms of process, when would the CCAs need to commit to the next phase? And remember, so we're in phase 2A right now, correct?
Correct.
And so the next phase is phase 2B, which means we go on to shortlisting and we incur the costs associated with shortlisting and negotiating PPA. And then the final phase is whether we decide to participate in that PPA or not, correct? So when do we have to indicate an interest in wanting to be in phase 2B? And then when do we anticipate getting to phase 3? And I know that's out of your control, having done that myself. And then, and what are the costs associated for participating in phase 2B? And is it dependent on how many we decide to move to phase 2B? I'm assuming there is some cost associated with the amount of PPAs that we decide to move forward, or BTAs in this case. And then on the ones that didn't provide a price, what is the next step for those types of resources?
Yeah, I'll get to the hype points on upcoming slide, but with respect to your questions around the moving to phase 2B, our target would be to be able to have that discussion and present what our forecasted costs would be for entering into 2B at around the November board meeting. Obviously, to your point, that'll vary depending on how many projects there are and how many project participants within each project. But the intent would be that we would then start basically splitting it off, where members that are not interested in certain projects don't incur costs for those projects. So if we have costs of negotiations with a PPA, that'll only be borne by those members that are pursuing that PPA. And same would go for the bill transfer.
Okay, because I did hear that there was a November 6th or October 16th deadline, which is today. I think I heard that from
That was for the expressions of indicative interest, so we can help hone down which projects are indicatively of interest to the members and remove the remainder so we can get that hold period released on those other projects.
Okay, but commitment to phase 2B doesn't happen until the November board meeting. Okay.
Yeah.
And even if you
So
didn't
that would be like,
indicate that-
we're definitively taking a interest, like we want to move forward with a specific amount of volume for a specific project.
But even if you didn't indicate an interest today, you could still participate in phase 2B.
We are going to be starting to move towards like exclusivity agreements. And so if we want to like reserve capacity, we need to understand who's interested in those projects so that we can like.
But if I recall in past efforts of these kind, phase 2B is open to everyone, whether you participated or not, and just indicating an interest.
Correct, but in order for us to move the process forward and understand who's participating, we have interim milestones for us to be able to shape what the potential total volume of offtake might be. So some of the projects have substantially more supply available than what the demand is, in which case coming in wouldn't be a problem. But if there are conflicts amongst members where there's enough more demand than supply, if I don't have an indication of interest in that project, it's going to be hard to then say to other members, we had somebody come in late that hasn't expressed interest and we don't want to do that.
That has happened. And that's how it's structured to happen. Or someone can drop out and not move on to phase 2B, even though they said they wanted to be in it. So
yeah, where we're at right now, there's been scattered interest across several different projects. So the more information I can get about which projects are even of consideration for you and your staff will help narrow that down. We're going to have further dialogue so that we can suggest that we're going to eliminate certain of those projects that maybe had less interest from members and focus in on the ones that are of the most interest. As soon as we can release those projects, then they're free game for the market for you all to pick up.
Yeah, Philippe, may I jump in for a quick second?
Yes.
This is a great discussion. And so just to put a fine point to it, today's deadline is really about knowing what we can release, because we're really committed to releasing as quickly as possible. And then also knowing what projects are good candidates for exclusivity, because we don't want to enter into exclusivity without knowing that we're pretty serious. And so we're using the language expressions of interest to do this. I think, Monica, you raised a great point, which is between now and the phase 2B decision, should we let parties who haven't expressed interest then join into the phase 2B? I think we can work that out. And I know this time around is kind of a first time for this type of large solicitation for us, and you've dealt with the complexity here. So the broad philosophy, though, is that parties that join into the phase 2A, get access to the information, and then get the right to join into a 2B. We've discussed that we don't have a policy for allowing someone who skipped a 2A to come into a 2B. In this case, what you're not talking about is not that. It's more of a sort of small issue that may only matter in a couple circumstances. So I think we'd like to take it case by case for now. But it's easier, of course, if everybody knows what they want. And I get that that's a hard ask. So hopefully we can work this out from here. And all of you should know that your staff have been doing a great job. We've had your staff rolling up their sleeves and in the guts of a lot of spreadsheets. So I feel on that side, your staff's been really well engaged and I'm thankful for it.
Jim,
I
Sorry,
really
back to you.
appreciate the prompt feedback from many of your staff. And-
before I go to Director Hale, that response was complex enough that my request would be that we get prior to the November meeting, maybe a slightly condensed or simplified version of that in the written report, just so we can understand the participation options by phase and have it in writing. I'm not sure I could explain what you just said to my team. So anyway, that's my request.
That's when you phone Monica.
All right, I go to Director Hale.
Can I just ask you, Philippe, to elaborate a little bit on what I think I heard you said with respect to, or what I think I heard you say with respect to the BTA project that is solar PV plus 4-hour lithium in various counties. I think you said that didn't score as well due to deliverability concerns. And I'm noticing that it's sounds like it's fairly distributed and would be connecting at distribution level and not transmission from the acronyms there.
That's correct. Yeah, it's distribution connected resources. And so we've hosted some panels where we've brought in developers focusing on different topics. One of those was focused on DG type resources that do distribution connected. And in this, they raised that from a policy standpoint, a lot of these resources are very much challenged now in being able to get deliverability. They effectively have to come online and apply for deliverability after the fact from the CAISO. And so from our standpoint, if we wish to look at that project for an ownership consideration, there's quite a bit of risk that we don't get value that might otherwise exist from RA associated with those projects. So we effectively have to look at it from like an energy only standpoint, if that's even of interest to the members. In general, like these types of projects would be great because we could have like a portfolio with a project located in each member's territory, but spread the risks that if any single project fails, it doesn't affect like the output and the RECs and everything else that you're trying to seek. But unless there's like policy changes around how these distribution connected resources get assessed for deliverability, it makes it challenging for us to consider them and get the same kind of value as we would from these other larger scale resources.
Thank you for that. Sounds like we might have some work to do on that policy area then in different venues than CC Power. Thank you.
And Philippe, may I jump in one more time? Just on the cost estimate, Monica indicated, be good to understand that. So Monica, going back to Director Padilla, going back to the budgeting process, one of the principles we operated under was to try and give you guys a sense of what expected spending would be across the year so you could plan for it, even though we knew that expected spending on the project side was not committed to yet. So we did, if we go back in sort of those expectation calculations, there were dollars associated with potentially moving through this 2B, whatever shape it looks. And we did break that into sort of by CCA level numbers. So I'm happy to work with everyone, but our hope is that sort of roughly, if you were adhering to that budget for guidance purposes, you somehow were at least slightly prepared for some of these dollars coming down the pike.
Thank you for that reminder. I'm sorry to just jump in. I did forget about that.
Yeah, no problem.
The part that's not clear is how many projects you intended to move through 2B. And since you got such a big response, are we thinking multiple projects or one or two? Because that'll make a difference on that budget. You eat through that budget pretty quick.
Yeah, and then also on, if we end up going down the bill transfer path, part of that is you go down a debt issuance path, which is likely quite expensive, and we want to make sure that parties who don't participate would be walled off from any of those expenses. So yeah, there's a lot of fleshing out on these budget proposals, but we'll be confident and able to do it once we get through this interest and exclusivity step heading into November.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anything
As of now,
on this item? Sound like you got a little more. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the last point that I want to make, Director Padilla, is if we can get just an expression of interest, it's non-binding, it helps us shape ultimately the direction that we go, and you're part of that conversation. Ultimately, we'll probably select, say, between 2 and 4 projects is my expectation out of this. And so that may give you an indication on potential costs that we ultimately have here. Amy, if you don't mind, can we go to slide 16, please? So as far as the next steps, we're continuing this discussion around the projects and volumes of interest. We're trying to get that done as quickly as possible with the intent that by Friday we can release the projects that are of no further interest to us. As we get that expression of interest, we can start running the default project allocation policies methodology to determine what a fair share might be amongst all of the members. I will say at this point, I have general expressions of interest without really megawatt volumes behind it from many of your staff. So that'll be helpful to kind of start framing, are we taking the full capacity from these projects? Are we looking for some smaller amount? And that'll help us kind of as we move forward here. I mentioned earlier, we are doing the deep dive technical diligence. So that's underway, and we'll report back to your staff on the findings from that. And then once we've come up with a more definitive shortlist and narrowed down those projects to roughly the 2 to 4 that I mentioned, at that point, we would seek those exclusivity agreements with those developers. Go to the next slide. So Director Padilla, to your question on the points allocation process and what we do with the RFI projects for QC15, we go to the next slide. We have gone through and done a qualitative assessment of those 61 projects that were bid to us under the RFI track. We sent that out to all of your staff along with the scores, a assessment of the deliverability risk. Thank you, Director Cyphers, to your team for helping inform those assessments. And from that, we've basically made recommendations on which of the projects appear to be the highest scoring and most likely preferred by you and your members or your CCAs. We're hoping by Friday to collect interest from you all about which of those projects that we've identified are of interest. And from that, we also are hoping to get expressions of interest or basically projects that you've identified through your own RFIs that you have interest in to be submitted to us, so that we can also then run a matchmaking function and see if there are overlaps amongst the various members that we can make recommendations that you either pursue sharing of points with other members to be able to, for example, get the full capacity allocated, even if you didn't have that full demand to match that capacity. And the intent then is like ultimately to have a final list of projects that would either be CC Power projects that members would allocate points to, or that we've facilitated connections between you all so that the developers are able to get more points allocated to them by being matched up with multiple CCAs through us. And so the intent here is to increase the bang for the buck for your points being allocated and get to higher thresholds of points being assessed to those various projects so that they have a higher chance of ultimately being studied for deliverability. Any questions on that? Okay, so we'll move next to the member allocation policy. So if we go to the next slide, please, Amy. Again, the member allocation policy is intended to help resolve conflicts between members when there's more demand than supply from a given project. The proposed approach that we would take here is
Philippe, I just want to make sure we're still on the same item. Is that true? Did you move on to the next item?
yeah, I guess this is probably the next item in terms
Okay,
of
then I want to pause and I want to check for public comment on item 6D, the build transfer phase 2A update before we move on to this policy. So I want to just check for any public comment. I see you, Director Chang, but let me just finish public comment. Okay, I don't have that. So go ahead, Director Chang.
Thank you, and sorry to flag this. I didn't realize we were quite moving on to another topic, so I appreciate you you noting that. My question is for the BTA projects. You know, this is a new undertaking by all the CCAs, and obviously a different level of complexity to own these projects versus traditionally the PPAs we've done. So the timeline that you laid out seems pretty tight and compressed, given that the form agreement for BTA agreements are still in progress. And so I'm just wondering, is that a realistic time frame? How should we think about that in ensuring that we've properly, prepared the overall process to even negotiate something if the form agreement's still being worked on?
Yeah, so the form agreement we've been working on for several months now. We've got a pretty well developed and robust term sheet associated with that. We do expect that depending on which project we ultimately are going to select, we're going to have to tailor that anyway in negotiations with the developers. As far as like the diligence that we're doing, we are doing a robust diligence process on these different projects to identify the potential risks associated with it. And so, yeah, our goal is ultimately like by the November timeframe, we want to be able to have exclusivity because these two of those three projects could potentially be solar plus storage project or like a 4-hour battery that could be competed for by members, by other CCAs, by other LSCs in the marketplace. So we wouldn't want to necessarily see those get poached by another party if that is something definitively of interest to members to pursue either. And that doesn't mean that we can't like break off negotiations if we identify a fatal flaw later on or other kind of concerns that come up during the negotiation process.
Jim, Morris, you got more of an answer. Go ahead.
So Howard, great question. The way I see it is, if for those who are interested, imagine 5 members are interested in actually pursuing a BTA, they would enter into a BTA phase 2B, and that would probably be, a long project to get to a go, no go. So imagine that could take 9 to 12 months. As Philippe said, we've done our best to gear up for that with the agreements and things like that. But in addition to negotiating, looking at the financing side, there will be a lot of work. And it's really going to be on that group. So that's why we sort of set these decision thresholds where only for the interested parties would they be part of it. And the near-term decisions really don't have anything to do with finalizing a deal. They just sort of they just say, are you going to be into the next round or not? So that's really what's at hand. Thanks, Philippe.
Thank you for that.
Go ahead, Director Padilla.
Yeah, my question is still another one around process, and I'm not sure which projects are being offered into the BTA process or vehicle, but I am interested in learning more about BTA. That's why we participated in this RFO to begin with. We really wanted to understand if there was a there relative to just traditional PPAs. Is it possible, since we know it's going to take so much more time, is it possible to give the members a little more time to evaluate whether they want to be in phase 2B for the BTA, given that it is going to incur a lot more legal expenses And maybe just bifurcate the decisions between just the traditional PPAs versus the BTA process.
Yeah, we can certainly take that under consideration and evaluate the timeframes and what we ought to present to you all to inform your decision making.
Jim Morris, you're on mute.
Just wanted to jump in one more time. When we looked at the BTA originally, we saw that there's a chance it makes economic sense for parties, but there's also a lot of learning and then financial maturation benefits that might be associated with it. In the solicitation, we still want to evaluate, does this make sense compared to a PPA option? And so we're going to be trying to do some of that work heading into November so that parties are clear. But I think what we're looking for right now is sort of before that, this initial expression of interest, which is non-binding, but we want to in good faith work with the developer and only sort of not release them or keep them if we see that members are interested. So again, there'll still be a whole month's worth of analysis and probably some technical work before we would tee up any go, no go decision into the 2B.
I'm going to hop in the queue and then I'll get to you, Director Chang. To my requests as we go down this path is to help educate this board a little more about some of the basics of BTA. We've had a good memo, but I think some of our own learnings recently have left us with more questions than answers around, does doing joint procurement through CC Power provide any risk reduction to us as an off-taker? And that's a very thorny question. Our credit is being utilized to purchase the asset. And so our working theory, which is very much a hypothesis at this point and not a conclusion, is that it would be difficult for us to shield ourselves from risks and liabilities as a result of that. If that's wrong, I would love us to be thinking about that problem, because obviously we don't get the benefit of an LLC type limitation. And so to the extent that public agencies have solved this, we did find SMUD has a BTA battery project contract they've completed. That's the only public agency BTA storage contract we've found in California so far. So that's one question. The other is just learnings about the fairly simple things, like I just learned today, the team has known for months, but that the deadline for completing a purchase from an IRS rule standpoint is pre-COD. Otherwise, you don't get the direct pay. If you've got a dozen of those kind of simple learnings that this board could get educated about, that'd be really handy, just so that we can kind of level up a little bit. I'm finding that I'm just kind of catching up myself in the past few weeks. So thanks. And I'll go to Howard Chang.
Thanks. On that point, that highlights a lot of open questions that I think we have to better understand and making a decision on whether to move forward on a BTA. And that's a long, complicated process with a lot of learnings. And I'll just note that Ava has an interest in really doing that diligence, but also have a big question mark on whether we would actually ultimately want to move forward, given the risk assessment of putting debt on the balance sheet or whatnot, and all these other things. And so I'm just flagging that as a general awareness point, but also noting that it complicates this decision of there are potential PPAs on the same project that we would consider for a BTA. So I just want to make sure, at least within this group, we're on the same page of what's the realistic pace we can move forward on the BTA, and make sure that we're also properly communicating expectations with the counterparty that, hey, if we want to talk to you about a BTA and there's some interest for PPA, just being on the same page about that process and how that looks. So wanted to flag that one. Two, to the extent there is a non-quorum Brown Act violation of this group that has stronger interest in doing a BTA, that would be interesting to know. And maybe I'll flag that for you, Jim Morris, and our general counsel to think about. As long as we're compliant with the Brown Act, if we're able to actually start talking a little bit amongst a smaller group of BTA interests, that something that may be interesting to do. And then the last point I'll just make is my understanding in talking to some developers is there could be a possibility of doing one single project as half PPA, half BTA. And there may be some benefits of considering that, because then you have a project that is very much so down the fairway for us, and you have a price comparison, and you have an asset manager once that project's actually operational. So I just want to throw that out there. I don't know if that's part of the conversation as well, in all this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just strongly agree. We need to be able to talk about it. And at the fall forum, we are going to touch on this, Dr. Chang, and you'll see that we try to map out a little bit of what the BTA Phase 2B would look like. Again, we may have multiple projects in 2B, right, on their own sort of groups, but particularly on the BTA side, there's a lot of need for coordination. And so we haven't wanted to get ahead of anyone yet, but we're at the point now where we do need to start talking about it.
Okay, I think we hit a pause. So I think you got some good direction to consider timelines, to bring back some more information, to connect with our teams. All that's great. I want to check for public comment one more time though, because we just had a little bit of a robust discussion. So let's see if there's any public comment now on 6D. I'm not seeing any hands raised. Okay, so now looks like Philippe, you get to take us to 6E on default project allocations. Thanks.
That's good. Mary, are you bringing up the slides? Thank you. Okay. Yeah, so on the project allocations, we've laid out a general process by which we would look to undertake this effort. So starting in general with like, if we run a solicitation or have some other authorized mandate to go identify projects for consideration by the members, we would look to identify that project, due diligence, and then basically share the details about that project with your staff, likely through the resource planning working group. If there's interest demonstrated by members for that project, we would look to understand what are the potential volumes that each member has an interest in securing from that project. And then we would run this proposed policy of and methodology to determine what a initial allocation approach might be between the members for their respective volume shares of the offtake. Once we've done that initial default run, we'll look to get feedback from the members, and they can either accept those volumes that they've taken, or they could say, I'm not interested anymore, I want out of this project. And we would put that capacity back into the pool to be allocated out amongst the remaining interested project participants. We would then either run that same methodology again in order to allocate at the capacity, or we could go down the path of like negotiating amongst the members on whatever fair and equitable distribution there might be. So an example of that might be if there's insufficient demand to take the full supply of the project, we can likely give every member exactly what they've asked for within that project, and everybody should be happy, and then we just won't contract for the full offtake from that resources supply that's available. Once we've gotten that final determination on the shares, we would bring those projects to the CC Power board for approval to enter into negotiations or the PPA with that project developer. We did include a consideration that in the future, there might be standard products like RA, where we may have some delegations of authority granted to the general manager from the board to facilitate timely transactions and being efficient in the marketplace. And so in those circumstances, it would only be if there was like a non-conforming allocation where there was some negotiation amongst the members that did not align with this policy, that we would still look to bring that to the board for ultimate approval, that everybody's comfortable with the shares. So that's kind of the general approach and process that we would follow. And then if we go to the next slide, the actual methodology that we would apply is such that when we look at 100% of the supply that's available, we are proposing to allocate 50% of that to be available to members on an equal weighted basis. So each member can get 1/9 of half of the project capacity. And then the remaining capacity we would allocate out on either a load share or peak load share basis, depending on what kind of product is the primary pursuit from that project. Load share being more related to like RPS resources, peak load share more based upon like capacity and RA resources. So we do expect that when we are looking at smaller projects, this will give everybody a opportunity to participate relatively equally in the project. But when we start looking at larger projects, we're likely going to hit the cap in terms of the demand that some of the smaller members have from that resource. And therefore, more of the capacity is going to ultimately be allocated out on a load share basis amongst the members. So we've provided a couple examples to show generally how this would work. In the first example here, we've got a relatively small 100 megawatt renewable project. And suppose that all of our members were to participate in this project. We would allocate out that first 50 megawatts, and everybody would be eligible for 5.5 megawatts approximately. And then we would run the proportion allocation, and everybody would get a certain volume associated with that. The far right column shows the minimum that you would be entitled to. So if we had project participants cap out in terms of their demand or choose not to participate, the amount of volume that you could take from that project would increase. So I want to be very clear, that's just a minimum that you would be eligible to accept from that project. Next, if we move to the next example, we've got a larger project, 1,000 megawatt resource on the next slide. So in the first step up above, I kind of broke this out so you can see the effects of the two stages that we're talking about, with first the equal allocation and then the proportional allocation. So let's say that some of our smaller members did not want to take their full eligible volumes from this large project. In this example, we've identified that maybe Valley and Redwood want to take less than even their equal allocation share. And so they're not going to participate in the proportional allocation. Well, at that point, we've shifted over the megawatts that are not being allocated equally in that total row over to what's now available for proportional allocation amongst all the members. So what you can see is that the larger members are now getting a larger share of that project. Now, let's say with the available supply that is now allocated proportionally, if next we have certain members that say, I don't want that full allocation of supply that I'm entitled to. So in the next example, step 2, we've got PCE getting capped out on their proportional allocation, and Sonoma as well. They've said, I want a total of 100 megawatts for PCE and 70 for Sonoma. That means that now we can allocate even more capacity to the remaining members that do have that appetite for incremental demand. And so as what you can see here is that the percentage of the project starts to skew much more towards like the equivalent load share percentage that the members make up of the total load that CC Power represents. And so everybody is able to have access to the project in what we feel is a relatively fair and equitable manner. We have one last example on the next slide where let's suppose one member entirely decides not to participate in a project. So just use Ava as an example. They're a large member making up the biggest load share percentage. Well, their removal from the project now means that there's significantly more capacity available to all of the other members. And so now, if you look at 3CE as an example, they could actually get a higher percentage of the project's offtake than what their load share percentage would entitle them to otherwise. And so this means that even though there were multiple project participants, and in the original framing, 3CE maybe was not going to get its full allocation, they are still actually able to get more than their load share basis from this project, and still be able to use that capacity or those attributes to meet their compliance requirements from this project. So I'll pause there and see if there's any questions about the policy and the methodology and how this all works.
Yeah, let's go to Director Pedia.
Well, having participated in 4 project oversight committees, I know this process and this problem all too well. And I appreciate you going through these various examples, and I can tell you that you probably did not cover the one that's gonna be important. And actually members deciding what amounts they want. I think a lot of it is gonna be dependent on what you end up shortlisting, the size, and how it fits into the participants or potential participants' portfolios. And so I know that when we went through this process the 4 other times, we did it all at the project oversight committee level. We did not bring it to the board until we were ready with, this is what we each want to take, this is what we agreed to. We agreed that if we couldn't come to that resolution at staff level, then it would go to the board. But for the most part, we worked it out. We were very flexible. We were all looking for procurement to meet MTR, which was all load share based. So it was an easy formula, but some dropped out. Some decided they wanted more because it met their other portfolio needs. So I'm not sure if we're voting on this today or not, but I caution that this might be a little bit, we may be boxing ourselves in too much if we have the board set this allocation methodology. Let the project oversight committee that are going to be participating in these projects work out some of these issues first.
Director Padilla, does it make sense to ask General Manager Morris and Philippe to explain what is meant in the policy by default? Because I think that was the intent of using that word. So was to allow flexibility in the case that you directly illustrated. Would that help answer the question? I believe this is a voting item for today. That's why I'm pressing that.
I'm just not sure that there was a problem that we were trying to fix, because my point is that we worked this through at the project oversight committee level. So we didn't have to have the board tell us what to do in order to figure this out. So I'm not sure why the board needs to opine if there's a problem that we're trying to fix.
Let's start with staff.
Maybe I can jump in. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So good question, Director Padilla. What we want here is, as Chair Seifert indicated, this isn't just a default starting point. We fully recognize that things can iterate from there, but we wanted some sort of basis to put a line in the sand to get things started. We think this does that, and we think it gives a lot of flexibility for everybody to weigh in and iterate on it. And it's got the right principles. So my recommendation is we can pass this today. It'll help us near term. And again, no one's committing to anything really other than just using this default as a starting point for conversations. And from there, we can always come back and adjust it or not use it. And I think it's also worth noting it's only for oversubscribed projects where we wanted some sort of default proposal to fall back to. We don't really expect too many of our projects are going to be oversubscribed, but we thought it was prudent to pass this at this time.
Thanks. Let's go to Director Hale.
So I want to probe a little bit. Thank you. I want to probe a little bit, General Manager Morris, on the language you used there. You called it a default. You also called it a starting point. And I think those are on two, for me, those are on two opposite ends. Yeah. I think what I'm hearing Director Padilla talk about is staff can, based on interests, we can express individually how we think a project would be subscribed. And I think the policy ends up being a safety net if you can't come to agreement, or a backstop. And is that to me is more like a default.
Versus initial is an initial allocation
versus
policy.
the beginning. Right. Yeah. And I do think there's power in telling staff, figure it out. You know what our interests are individually. Let's see how that shapes up when we talk as a collective. And if we can't come to agreement, everybody knows what the backstop approach would be. So you don't get strong-armed into getting less than you wanted or are entitled to, because there is this backstop. And from that perspective, I feel like this is a fair allocation approach. So I'm comfortable with it, so long as it is that backstop and not not necessarily the starting point. Because I think the other challenge, if you call it a starting point, is I could come in the room and say, okay, I am entitled to this much. I don't actually need it, but I can cut a side deal over here with somebody else who does. And I don't think we want that kind of an environment. We want everybody coming to the table with their own individual interests, working it out as a collective. And if not, then we know what we're entitled to. And that would still be our own, just to address our own interests.
Superb. Philippe, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that characterizes it well, that it's intended as a mechanism to ensure that we avoid conflict and that we have an efficient manner of being able to determine what a equitable approach for allocating the shares is. My biggest concern with a negotiation amongst the staff is just the time that it takes to come up with what that desired allocation approach ought to be if there's no guardrails or guidance for how that works, particularly in the competitive market environment that we're operating. So that's why it was also framed as like a default in that we're putting that out as like our initial recommendation, but at the same time we had that if that's not the desired approach, that we can pursue alternative methods for how we allocate the capacity, provided that we get buy-in from all the members that they feel like that's the appropriate approach to do it. Similarly, we have specific carve-outs, like if there's a compliance obligation that is imposed upon the members that deviates from this consideration around a load share or peak load share basis, that we would look to align with that guidance that's been ordered by the CPUC as an example for how to allocate the capacity amongst the members.
To Director Hale's comment that landed well for me about not using the word initial, would you feel comfortable saying that this is kind of where we end up if staff can't reach an agreement, or our collective staff can't reach an agreement by a deadline? In other words, I think that's very fair to be commercially sensitive to market movements and timing and to impose a deadline on our teams. I think that would make me feel comfortable.
I think that's reasonable.
Any objection to that clarification? Do people feel that that is helpful? I see Director Shaw.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Cyphers. Not an objection. I'm trying to make sure that what we're being asked to take action on is like what's proposed and is the document that we have. So is that component that Jeff just laid out and what we've been talking about, that this is a backstop, not a starting point, is that intended under default allocation method number 1, that the members are to provide an indication of the desired participation? Does that come out of the project oversight groups that are going to make that initial allocation? Or are we overlaying a whole different structure on top of the memo?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Rob, Director Shaw, that effectively the process that we have of getting that initial expression of interest should align with what the desired volume is from each member that would come out of the initial starting point for those discussions in a negotiation amongst them. Our intent is to try to make everybody happy and give them what they want. And so, as we mentioned earlier, this really only comes into effect in the event that there's not enough to go around, in which case then we have to kind of figure out how do we reduce some of that. And members could just as easily say, I'm willing to forego some of that capacity on an elective basis in order to solve the issue, right, of there not being sufficient to go around.
I have a proposal, and then I'll go to you, Director Chang, is that just in between default allocation method steps 1 and 2 on page 18. So step 1 says members are to provide an indication of desired participation in the project. And before we get to 50% of the available project capacity shall be allocated according to X, what if we just insert between 1 and 2 a step that says if the member staff can reach agreement on the allocation among members, the process stops there. If members cannot agree, then move on to steps 2 and 3 and 4. I think this resolves Director Padilla and Hale's concerns and mine as well. And I'm glad you've raised this because I hadn't thought of that. And I hate editing on the fly in a public meeting, so I apologize. But I would like to see some clarification of this soon. In part because we do have new members knocking on our door, and I think having this kind of thing be clear could be very handy in that conversation as well. So
Yeah, I think that generally I'm in agreement with that approach. And we could clarify that this really only goes into effect in the event that there's not alignment amongst the members on what that allocation should be.
And just looking for a potential nod from general counsel, you think that kind of live editing wasn't too unkosher?
Well, in anticipation of that question, I have, and let the record note my first day back on this job. You guys are editing a resolution and policy in real time. I would throw it out to the board and to Alex and Philippe on the timing of this. And I have drafted a quick phrase to try to capture what I just heard from the board. And I think it would go into the guiding principles between 1 and 2. I wonder if, I'd like to have a discussion to educate myself as to the timeliness of this and how it would fit in and whether we should do it in a subsequent discussion or whether we should do it right here and now.
Jim Morris, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I'm looking for Philippe to shake his head, but Philippe, my feeling is the proper step would be to bring this back in November, because the goal, as I think Director Hale worded it well, is to have it be a sort of backstop mechanism, and we can tune up the language, we can add this step, and everybody can review it in a timely fashion. And since we're planning to bring potential go no go decisions on project phase 2Bs by then anyway, it seems logical that we could also simultaneously approve that process. I think we can work in good faith with everybody until then. And so I think that could sort of take the urgency out of this for today.
I withdraw my live edit proposal. All right, let's go to Director Chang.
First, I'll just say I generally agree with this approach that's been proposed, in addition to the sort of amendments that folks have proposed. Of obviously, if staff can agree to something different and everyone's happy, let's do that as opposed to default to this structure. I also want to just highlight, as one of the larger, I think the largest CCA in this group, I think this helps to manage that. For those that want more, the smaller CCAs have a fair share, at least a minimum share of that. And I'm very comfortable with that. I think that's a good approach. I think it's worth highlighting there's the opposite issue, which is worth just at least putting out there, which is there a minimum amount? And I don't think there would be a forced minimum amount. I don't think that makes sense. But in terms of the types of projects that we may be pursuing, which may be novel technologies or trying to learn from offshore wind or trying to learn from project ownership, it may not be as much focused on how much share you're getting, but rather being a part of it. And so I just want to throw that out there, that we're mindful of that. Of course, is sometimes there may be the opposite issue, which is parties don't want a lot. They just want a little bit. And how do we make sure that we can hit that sufficient volume? Because particularly for project ownership, you probably can't take a portion of a project. You're probably going to want to, they're going to say, the developer's going to say, you have to go buy this whole thing if you want to buy it. And so we just need to be prepared for that, of course. And I'm not suggesting we need to amend this, but this doesn't necessarily account for that. So I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, great point. Director Chang, just so you know, we also checked in, there's a consultant we use, Bob Tang, who is familiar with some of the joint action agencies. And he had relayed that they've gotten by without having such a policy because every deal is optional. And so it's on the staff at CC Power to come together and find a path forward for the members. In this case, with the potential new members and this prospect of an oversubscribed project, we wanted something there, and I think we can still get it. But I still think the larger principle here is that it has to be a good move for the member to opt in, and everything is a cafeteria menu model where you choose into it. It's never forced on you. So for that sort of minimum goal, I think that's an interesting one. And yeah, if the deal doesn't look right for someone, my guess is they would opt not to move forward.
So I think
Of course, yeah.
we're going to get a second shot at this. So we're going to see this in the next meeting. Thank you. So I'm going to
Can I, sorry, I have one other just important point to at least throw out there, which is,
brief.
I don't think this sort of share allocation has any implication on voting impact if there's a need for a contract workout later or decisions on a contract later to change the weighting of that vote. So I just want to confirm that's the case. Because if an entity were to take 35% share and another entity takes 2, is there? I just want to confirm. Is there any implication?
I believe that's correct under our current bylaws. Is that? I'm seeing.
That is 100% correct. Inside the project, once you are into the phase 3, you can layer in whatever governance structure you want. What we did back in 2022 was the board, given the complexity of some projects and the need to move efficiently, they designated some authority to the GM to help administer and manage projects going forward inside of phase 3. But each project can approach that on a case-by-case basis. And I don't mean to take too much time, but from a lot of these concerns, you look at the phases and you say, okay, in phase 1, where we're doing work planning and looking at what deals we might originate, we need a structure for thinking about big versus small and serving all members. We also need that in phase 2, and we need that in phase 3. I think, Howard, your point was in phase 3, and then also speaking to the strategic plan, how do we robustly incorporate that into the budgeting and work planning, which really sets up the phase 1 work. So we have to have these types of policies across the timeline of any project origination through CC Power.
Okay, so I want to wrap this and ask for public comment, and then we do have a brief closed session. So let me just check for public comment first. And then while I'm looking for public comment, can somebody let us know when the link to the closed session arrived in our inboxes so we can find it in the top 600 emails, perhaps? And I don't see any hands raised.
Yeah, so I sent everybody a primary email that gives you a time frame. Amy, do you know when you sent it out?
Yes, I resent the closed session link at 1:02 today.
Perfect. All right. So I will see y'all in closed session, and we'll try and keep it snappy. Thank you.
Just for clarity, Mr. Chairman, so we're gonna not have a report out. We're not gonna take any action in closed session, so we will adjourn the meeting therein.
Thank you very much. That can relieve people to go back to their other work. Thank you. I will see you in a minute.